Welcome back to Congress, the sequel. This time, it's Congress. Okay, so we're going to wrap up Congress by talking about a couple of different topics fairly quickly. There's a lot more we can say about Congress than what we're going to talk about, but I think this will give you a good overview of the political science literature and studies and findings on it. Last time we talked about incumbency advantage, we have this quote from David Mayhew in his famous book, The Electoral Connection, and basically saying that if people intended for a pair of national assemblies to serve members' reelection goals, then members of Congress would have a hard time improving what already exists in Congress. Basically saying that the system itself is designed to help, or appears to be designed at least, to help members of Congress win elections. We mentioned that there is indeed an advantage that incumbents running for re-election have, that an electoral advantage, specifically 90 to 93% of incumbents every election year tend to win their re-election. And they don't just win, but they win by huge percent of the vote. So 60 to 65% of the vote on average. Some incumbents do not even face challengers. So for instance, there are a lot of congressional districts where the district is so lopsided, Republican or Democrat, that the other party will not even run a candidate against them, which guarantees that the incumbent wins because there's no challenger. So why do we have the incumbency advantage? What things explain it? We're going to talk about three today. Now, the research on incumbency advantage is actually pretty vast. There are a lot of studies that try to drill down to the exact explanations for it. We're going to hit a couple of broad notes on this and talk about three general explanations. These tend to be the better explanations. The first one is home style. It's familiarity with the voters and the district. Members of Congress spend a lot of time in their district talking with people. They show up at the parades and the funerals, all the things we talked about with advertising. And so that's going to help them. They gain a lot of familiarity with the issues, the interests, and the problems of their community, and they use their position in Congress and on committees to try to address those. The second one, and the one that you do need to know, is fundraising. Running for Congress requires millions of dollars. One California Senate race a couple of years ago, I believe each side spent nearly $50 million in that race, and some of the races in the coming years are very likely to top $100 million. So members of Congress need a lot of money. As it turns out, the committees are actually very good for that. Interest groups will often donate to members on committees that oversee legislation that the interest group is concerned about, and they'll donate to members of Congress in order to get influence those laws and that access. Now, let me tell you what we know based on the political science research about this. On its face, it seems very corrupt, right? Some interest groups are giving money to members of Congress. The members of Congress vote for the legislation they want, and that looks like outright bribery. And if indeed that's what was going on, it would be bribery, and it would also be illegal. But it's not. What typically happens is that interest groups will donate with the hope of getting their preferred legislation on the agenda. They just want a vote on it. And they can try to persuade the members of Congress using lobbying, but the donations, the impact of the donations themselves typically have an effect on the legislation being heard or just coming up for a vote on the committee. Remember, a committee does not have to vote on a piece of legislation. If a member of Congress proposes a piece of legislation, it gets sent to a committee, and most legislation actually dies in committee. It just sits there and never gets a vote and never gets sent back for a full vote in the House or the Senate. So an interest group does not want their preferred legislation getting stuck in committee, and so oftentimes they'll actually donate to members of both parties, knowing that some of them will vote against their legislation. They're not buying votes, they're buying access, and they're buying a spot on the agenda with that money. A lot of people still view this as corrupt. I just wanted to highlight that it's more nuanced than what actually most people think it is. More generally, incumbents are very good at raising money. Both parties actually have telephone banks where members of Congress go and log in a certain number of hours every week making phone calls to raise money for their elections and for the party itself. They spend a lot of time doing this, which means that they're going to raise a lot of money, and so that also gives them a fundraising advantage that often translates into electoral advantage. And finally, we mentioned this last time, constituency service. This is simply the members of Congress, or more properly their staff, helping citizens with bureaucracy, agencies, and other problems that they have with government, just helping people navigate through the federal government, or if they need to, stepping in if they're having problems at the state government because of their connections with state officials and state elected officials. Let's back up and just wrap up the discussion of Mayhew by talking about what things it explains. Again, Mayhew makes the assumption that members of Congress are, quote, single-minded seekers of re-election, and his theory can help us explain congressional behavior, the things that members of Congress do more often in their daily lives, such as position-taking, advertising, and credit claiming, and it can also explain the structure of Congress. The committees, for instance, will help members of Congress get projects and money for their state, which helps them get reelected. Party leaders make legislation more efficient. That means that members of Congress spend less time doing the minutia of legislative policymaking, like scheduling bills and so forth. It frees them up to do the other things, such as constituency service, the advertising, position taking, and credit claiming that helps them get reelected. And finally, there's huge amounts of staff and a huge budget that's spent on staff that also helps members of Congress with constituency service, and that helps them get reelected. The result of all this is that there is an incumbency advantage. Members have a huge financial advantage and advantage in name recognition, along with other things, that translates into most of them, most elections, winning reelection. If you ever wonder why you do not see a lot of big changeover in Congress, you very rarely will see one party with 100-vote lead in the House, and then the next election the other party has a 100-vote lead. You don't see that kind of thing because there's very little turnover in Congress. The biggest swings that we see in recent elections are about 60 seats, and that's considered a landslide victory for a party if it gains 50 seats in elections. On average, one party or the other will gain between 10 to 25 seats. Let's talk about redistricting. The House of Representatives has 435 members. The seats are allocated by state population. Large states, as we talked about the first week, have more seats in the House of Representatives. This was the Great Compromise. The states create the districts. The districts are just geographical units from which the members of Congress are elected. If you've never seen a map of these districts, here's one for Colorado. I'll explain in a second why I didn't use Wyoming. Colorado has 7 congressional districts, and you notice these are numbered. All of the counties in the same congressional district are colored the same. So all of these counties here are district number 3. And this tiny little area here is district number 1 in Denver. Why are they different sizes? Because, as we talked about, they're allocated by state population, but also because there's a requirement that there has to be roughly equal population in each district. So there has to be the same number of people in this district as there is in this tiny district. And as we know, there are more people that live in Denver than live in Vail or Breckenridge. And so because very few people live out here, those districts are just going to be bigger. So that's the nature of congressional districts. Wyoming, the reason I didn't use that is because we only have 1 seat. We have a small population, we have 1 seat, so there's no boundaries to draw. The district boundaries for the House of Representatives seat in Wyoming are the exact same as the 2 Senate seats, which is to say the state of Wyoming. Most states, however, have a lot of districts. California has probably around 50. Texas, about the same. New York, I believe, somewhere around 30 or maybe even 40. So some states have a lot of these districts and a lot of seats in Congress. Who draws them? Well, it may surprise you that the state legislatures, and sometimes in consultation with the governor, actually draws those district lines. Now, it should be obvious. State legislatures are also partisan institutions. The majority party tends to control the structures and the institutions of the state houses. What that means is that this is not an apolitical process. The process of drawing these districts is actually very political, and we're going to get into that in a second. So let's define a couple of terms. Redistricting is simply the redrawing of congressional districts. Members of Congress are elected from within those districts. Every 10 years, we have a census. By the way, this is why we have the census, so that we know how many people are in each state, so we know how many seats in the House of Representatives each state gets. And then after that is determined, the states have to redraw the districts to have an equal population or to add or remove a district. If a state loses population, a district will be taken away. If it gains, it'll be given to that district and taken away from another. So that's what we mean by redistricting. There is a term you see in political lore known as gerrymandering. And the difference between redistricting and gerrymandering typically is that gerrymandering simply means the redrawing of congressional districts for political gain. Now, the term refers to Governor Jerry in Massachusetts, and the governor was working with his party to redraw the district map. You can actually see the counties that he put into one district up here. It stretches across the north side and then the west side of Massachusetts. And the story goes that a state legislator saw this map and said, "Oh, that looks like a salamander." And another state legislator, thinking he was very clever, said, "No, it looks like a gerrymander." Yeah, their sense of humor back then was not the same as it is today. I've never understood the humor in that, but they thought at the time it was uproariously funny, so okay. But hopefully this does give you an idea about the difference between redistricting and the term gerrymandering. Now, what do we mean for political gain, and how would you draw a district for political gain? Let me show you two examples. First of all, this is the 38th Congressional District. It's in California. And you can see our journey begins in Pomona. We head east to Hacienda Heights, north to La Puente, over to Montebello. We take a brief stop through East Los Angeles, down to Poca Rivera, and then finally ending our journey in Norwalk. You can see how these district lines weave in and out. These are often neighborhoods, and a lot of times these lines are drawn to put some people into one district and other people in another based largely on their partisanship. We'll talk about the technology here in a second, but actually state legislators know typically how people are registered to vote or what their political leanings are, and they can draw a district to include more Republicans or Democrats in that district, and therefore give that party that controls the state legislature more seats in Congress. Now, let me show you a second one. This is my absolute favorite example of gerrymandering. This district is a work of art. This is just a thing of beauty. You ready for it? Here it comes. This is the 4th Congressional District in Illinois. It begins over in the west side of Chicago. We take I-55 south. We get off on the Cicero exit. We go over to 290 for a brief jaunt, and then we get off the 290 exit, go through this neighborhood around here. We hit 294 north for a little ways. We get off on the Stone Park exit. We weave through these little neighborhoods until we get to I-94 and the end of the district. Look at this thing of beauty for a second. And think about the fact that part of the district right in this area on 294, you literally can stand on one side of the freeway, be in one congressional district, stand in the freeway, hopefully the median so you don't get run over, be in the district number 4, and then go to the other side of the freeway and be in a completely different congressional district, a 3rd congressional district. Now, I think it's pretty obvious that these district lines were not drawn for apolitical reasons. It's pretty obvious that they were trying to pack in this case, I believe it's Democrats, trying to put a lot of Democratic neighborhoods into this district and leave the Republican neighborhoods in this Cook area off of 290. So that'll give you a sense of what redistricting, and particularly in this case gerrymandering, what gerrymandering looks like and the lengths to which some state legislatures will go to draw these districts in a way that benefits them politically. Let's talk about a couple of Supreme Court rulings. You will not need to know the names or the dates of these rulings. You'll just need to know the general findings. Generally, the Supreme Court does sometimes scrutinize the drawing of districts, but it's almost always racial redistricting that they scrutinize. The court has ruled that redrawing the districts to empower or to take power away from particular races is unconstitutional. It is not constitutional. So, for instance, redrawing a district in a way that dilutes a minority vote in that district, the court will strike that down and force the state legislature to redraw that district. There was a famous case in Texas where over about 10 or 15 years, the Hispanic community had grown to become a majority in that district, and then the very next year, the state legislature basically cut it in half and moved those communities into two separate districts where they were a minority again. The Supreme Court ruled that unconstitutional. So racial redistricting is not constitutional. On the other hand, political redistricting is constitutional according to the Supreme Court. Now, you don't need to know this term. The Supreme Court has tended to say that this is non-judiciable. In other words, they will not enter the, quote, political thicket of political gerrymandering. What that basically means is that the Supreme Court is telling politicians, we're not going to touch this with a 10-foot pole. They're just not going to even dive into the issue of political redistricting. They have said that in some cases, a district could be drawn in such an overtly partisan way to benefit one party that it would be unconstitutional, but they have not yet seen that district. They might look at the Illinois district, just suggesting. All right, partisan gerrymandering is when the majority party in the legislature redraws the seats to increase the number of seats their party gets. So let's say a Democratic legislature in California redraws the congressional districts to increase the number of Democrats in Congress. Now, we're talking about this in terms of Congress. This actually also applies to state legislatures because, and this is where things get even a little weirder, state legislatures are also responsible for drawing the state legislative district lines. They draw their own districts. And so you see this type of political and especially partisan gerrymandering quite a bit for state legislative seats. Now, the reality is that partisan gerrymandering is actually very rare at the congressional level. One, it's kind of hard to do when you have divided government if the governor has a say and the governor's of the other party. Then what typically happens in those situations is what we call incumbency protection, which is that the parties get together and they protect the incumbents from both parties. Instead of trying to take a Democratic district, let's say 55% of the voters in the district are Democrats, instead of trying to take 6% of the Democrats out of that district and so that the Democratic incumbent loses, a lot of times they'll take Democrats out of a Republican district, put it into a Democratic district. That way you have more Democrats in the Democratic district, more Republicans in the Republican district. Both incumbents become safer. Let's back up and talk about the normative implication of this. I hope it's obvious that this creates a real dilemma for democracy. Democracy basically means voters choose their representatives, but with gerrymandering, you have a situation where representatives are choosing the voters. Democrats are choosing to have more Democratic voters in their districts, knowing they're going to vote for based on their party lines and that they're going to get reelected. And the new technology, especially GIS, Geographic Information Systems, has actually made it a lot easier to gerrymander. I have seen district maps where, and I'm not making this up, where if you imagine a cul-de-sac with 5 houses on it, and one house tends to vote Republican, the neighbor tends to vote Democrat, the next 2 vote Republican, and then the last neighbor votes Democrat. I've seen congressional districts where the line goes through and around those houses so that literally 2 people on the same cul-de-sac, neighbors, are in 2 different congressional districts. It also has made congressional elections a lot less competitive. You see incumbents winning more often, winning with higher percents of the vote, and running uncontested a lot more. So there is a negative consequence to this redistricting and the ease in which state legislatures can carve out maps to put Republicans and Democrats in it, it means that congressional elections tend to be a lot less competitive than the past, and incumbents tend to win a lot more today. So the incumbency advantage today is actually higher than it was back in the 1980s and 1970s. So that's all we're going to talk about with Congress. We're going to turn briefly and talk about the Wyoming legislature, the equality state. First of all, as we talked about with the Constitution, the Wyoming legislature is very similar to Congress. The structure of the legislature is almost identical. There are two houses. Each chamber has parties and leaders. Each one has committees. They have staff and budget, not nearly as much staff and budget as they do for Congress. Again, there's a House of Representatives and a Senate, two different bodies. The legislative process is also identical to what we see in Congress. A bill must pass both chambers, and then the governor also has to sign it. That's identical to the federal level. The main differences between the Wyoming legislature and Congress has to do with the libertarian and conservative culture of the state. So not only did the founding fathers of the Wyoming Constitution use the Constitution to reflect their libertarian and conservative values, they also created some limits on the state legislature that also reflected that. What are those limits on state power? We're going to list a couple of them. There are a few that you'll need to know. First of all, there is a ban in the Constitution on what's called social or local laws. This is basically the term you hear at the congressional level is earmarks. It's basically a pet project for a particular district. There's a famous case of a bridge to nowhere in Alaska, where the Alaskan senator was able to use his influence to get money for a bridge that connected an island with about 100 residents in it so that they could get to the mainland instead of using boats. And it became controversial because the amount of money you were talking about, you could have used the same amount of money instead of building a bridge to give every one of those residents a yacht. So those type of laws where they designate money for specific local projects that benefit certain communities are actually not allowed. And the founding fathers of the Wyoming Constitution, they feared these type of laws. They were afraid they'd be used to raid the treasury, to misuse the public money. The second way in which the Wyoming legislature is different from Congress has to do with very short sessions. The Wyoming legislature only meets for 60 days over the course of every 2-year cycle. 1 year, they will meet for 20 days. That's typically a budget session. The next year, they'll meet for 40 days. So from 1 year to the next, they're only meeting for 20 or 40 days in the spring, which means that it's very easy to delay legislation in the Wyoming legislature because they just don't have time to get to a lot of legislation. It maintains the status quo, and it also limits the number of things that the legislature could do. A third way in which the Wyoming legislature differs from Congress has to do with log rolling. Log rolling is a political science term. It's basically when two legislators get together and they make an agreement. They say, I'll vote for your bill if you'll vote for mine. This practice is actually very common in Congress. Members of Congress do this all the time, especially within their same party. One of them will propose an environmental regulation and the other will propose a tax policy. And they'll get together in order to get majority support within their party for each of those bills. They'll make an agreement. Okay, I'll vote for your bill if you'll vote for my bill. That's what we call log roll. In Wyoming, it is actually a criminal offense. It's considered a form of bribery, and people can go to jail for it. Probably not the territorial prison, probably a real jail, but nonetheless. In reality, log rolling is very difficult to prove, but technically it is something that is illegal under the Wyoming Constitution, and it reflects sort of this concern about giving too much power and having too much corruption in the Wyoming legislature. There's also a conflict of interest disclosure. You don't really need to know this, but basically if a legislator has a vested, especially economic interest in a piece of legislation, they're not allowed to vote on it. This can be controversial because let's say that a rancher is a member of the state legislature. Could he vote on a loans program for agricultural businesses that might or might not help his business? So this was one where there's a lot of gray area, but the main point is that the Wyoming founding fathers were very distrustful of legislatures. They did not want to give a lot of power to the legislature to pass policies and to spend the public tax money. Again, that reflects the libertarian and the conservative values and culture of the people in Wyoming. So they tended to want to limit the power of the legislature in order to reduce the danger of corruption or misuse of public funds. Finally, one last point is that the legislators in Wyoming are not representative of the Wyoming population in terms of demographics. This is sadly also true for most state legislatures around the country and also most legislatures around the world. It's important to understand that the members of the Wyoming legislature tend to be older, they tend to be more highly educated, they tend to be professionals, and especially lawyers. Again, this is true around the country and even in Congress. There's a lot of the members of Congress, a lot of state legislatures around the country and in Wyoming are lawyers, and nothing wrong with that, by the way. My brother's a lawyer. There tend to be fewer females. And again, unfortunately, this is not unique to Wyoming. This is a lot of research has been done about precisely why legislatures are not demographically representative. So that's all we have to say about Congress and the Wyoming legislature. The next lecture up will be about the presidency. See you next time.